other agenda items. We've got a great panel. After I give a few initial framing remarks, we're going to hear from my E3G colleague Tom Evans, who will give a little overview of what we think ought to be the key components of the mitigation work program. We'll hear from Marine Pouget, who will talk about from Climate Action France, who will talk about the relationship of the mitigation work program to the global stocktake. And we will hear also from Jamal Srouji from World Resources Institute, who will give us an update of what's happened here in the first week on the negotiating front. Then we will take some questions from all of you for the first panel, and then we'll bring up a second panel, which will be a more interactive discussion kind of format. We will start with Kaveh Guilanpour from C2ES, who many of you know from multiple years in this process, negotiating on behalf of a number of parties, and he will kick off some reflections on the first panel and sort of where we stand and where we need to go, some of the challenges we face. We will hear from Fernanda Carvalho from WWF Brazil, who will give a perspective as the chair of the Climate Action Network Mitigation Ambition Working Group. And finally, we will hear from Jonas van Freiesleben from the Denmark Climate and Energy Ministry, who his minister was one of the two ministers along with Grenada who was chairing the mitigation ambition track in the run-up to, during, and since COP26 under the UK presidency. Unfortunately, we had also hoped to have Giannina Santiago from AILAC, but unfortunately she got pulled into a meeting that her delegation is having with the incoming COP presidency, and I guess she couldn't really refuse to go to that meeting for a side event, so she's not with us. So let's just start with the context for this. I think everyone knows what was in Glasgow, but it's probably worth reading just a few pieces from the Glasgow decision that really set the context. In Glasgow, parties acknowledged that limiting global warming to 1.5 Celsius requires rapid, deep, and sustained reductions in global greenhouse gas emissions, including reducing global carbon dioxide emissions by 45% by 2030 relative to the 2010 level and to net zero around mid-century, as well as deep reductions in other greenhouse gases. So obviously this is not a trivial goal. This is not incremental change. We're talking about a transformation of the entire global economy to achieve this. Parties also agreed that, quote, this requires accelerated action in this critical decade, i.e. the 2020s, on the basis of the best available scientific knowledge and equity, reflecting common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, and in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty. So that's the grounding for why parties in Glasgow agreed to mandate this work program. Parties already acknowledged that the NDCs they put together for 2030 and 2025 under Paris are collectively inadequate and nowhere near in line with the 1.5C trajectory, and that this poses serious risks to both humans and natural ecosystems. In our view, the mitigation work program is clearly related to the global stocktake, but it's distinct. If you recall, the global stocktake was established as part of the Paris Agreement in 2015 to inform the next round of NDCs after 2030, whereas the mitigation work program is clearly aimed at increasing the ambition of the first round of NDCs under Paris in one way or another. So, and the other thing I would point out, we know very clearly from the IPCC Working Group 2 report that the less we do on mitigation and the farther we go above 1.5C, the more devastating the impacts are going to be, the more difficult the challenges of adaptation are going to be. For some sectors and ecosystems, adaptation becomes impossible or not feasible above certain temperature thresholds. And also, of course, we increase the magnitude of future loss and damage at a time when we've been hearing all this week how daunting current loss and damage is to vulnerable countries and communities around the world. So the notion that somehow it's mitigation versus adaptation, loss and damage makes no sense from a scientific point of view. It's both and. You have to go pedal to the metal on mitigation, and unfortunately, since we've waited 30 years to really start bending the emissions curve, we also have to go pedal to the metal on ramping up finance for adaptation and start to address loss and damage. So I think that's very important when you listen to this discussion. Now, there's a couple of themes we'll talk about. We'll talk about broadening and deepening sectoral decarbonization, energy, land use, transportation, industry, heavy industry. The IPCC, the IEA, and others have already provided very detailed sector and greenhouse gas decarbonization pathways. We know how many green steel plants we need to have deployed globally by 2030, and we have a pretty good sense, based on current steel production, which geographies they need to be in. But of course, many of these sectoral pathways and even some of the existing sectoral initiatives that are being taken are not fully reflected in countries' current NDCs. And so I think that's part of this, broadening and deepening sectoral decarbonization and bringing it into this process. No one is suggesting that countries be required to adopt binding sectoral commitments. But there is a lot that we can achieve through scaling up collaboration, reducing barriers, and providing incentives for actions to accelerate decarbonization in every sector. And I should note, for developed countries, this involves not only taking accelerated action at home, but delivering on ramping up means of implementation to support action by developing countries. And speaking of that, the IEA, in its report last June with the World Bank and others, demonstrated that to get developing economies on a pathway consistent with 1.5, we need to scale up clean energy investments from the current $150 billion a year to around $1 trillion a year by 2030. In other words, a factor of 7 over the next 8 years. Now, in December, the G7 leaders, and when they launched the Partnership for Infrastructure and Investment, acknowledged this IEA figure and committed themselves to try to accelerate the shift of investment into clean energy. We are calling on the G7 leaders, when they meet later this month in Elmau here in Germany, to reaffirm that pledge and, more importantly, to instruct their finance ministers to prepare concrete proposals to operationalize that pledge and bring those proposals back to them for action before COP27. So they back up their rhetoric with some action. There's also, you'll hear my colleagues talk about the need for capacity building for developing countries on economy-wide and sectoral decarbonization plans and policies, and also to share best practices amongst countries. There's a lot that we can learn from the subnational coalitions of states and cities and businesses and investors that have really started to practice radical collaboration, sharing best practices, discussing failures, supporting each other in improving over time. All of this can be done without reopening the Framework Convention and the Paris Agreement. So that concern should be put aside. We're not talking about renegotiating Paris. But parties really need to deliver on what they've already committed to do at COP27, which is to launch a comprehensive mitigation work program coming out of Sharm el-Sheikh that's designed to rapidly scale up both the ambition and the implementation of mitigation commitments, as well as the provision of support for developing country mitigation actions. And I would say, together with significant efforts to scale up finance for adaptation and loss and damage, agreement on such a mitigation work program will really be the bedstone of a successful COP in Sharm el-Sheikh. So let me now turn it over to my colleague, Tom Evans, who's going to come up and give a little overview of some of the thinking we've done on this and communicated to parties.
Thank you, Alden, and thank you everyone for coming today. And essentially what I wanted to quickly speak about, is a paper we wrote back in March on the idea of the mitigation work program and what it could look like. And the purpose of this paper was to just really start a conversation about its potential options and how it could actually play a useful role, as Alden described, in strengthening mitigation ambition and implementation in this critical decade. And I think, to begin with, when we were approaching this question of what's a useful role for the mitigation work program, We really wanted to look at it in its wider context. And if you remember back in Glasgow, in terms of what was actually agreed, that mitigation section of the Glasgow Climate Pact has a number of other elements which are really important to consider. We have annual high-level ministerial roundtables on pre-2030 ambition, and we have annual NDC synthesis reports to track and monitor how much progress we're making, as well as another LTS, long-term strategy synthesis report ahead of COP. And we really thought, in that context, how can the mitigation work programme play a role? Because actually, potentially some people would say that already feels like a work programme. You have ministerial, you have reports. What's the extra role that this decision could contribute to? And we had, broadly speaking, 6 kind of buckets of ideas that we wanted to share with the world. And we're pleased to see some of them being taken forward in the negotiations at the moment. And I think, the discussion over the course of the year will really kind of refine and identify what the strengths and weaknesses are. But nonetheless, we'll go through some of these ideas now. I think we thought the first important element would be really being clear about what exactly we're trying to do, what's the scope and the framing of this work programme. And even though it's clear in the Glasgow Climate Pact text in terms of the work programme being a process to scale up mitigation ambition in the critical decade, we thought it'd still be useful to have a reminder in the COP27 text around, for instance, the target for this being to halve emissions, that kind of minus 45% reduction in emissions on 2010 levels that the IPCC talk about. And we really wanted to be clear that it wasn't just NDCs, it's not just 2030 targets that are inadequate, but it's the implementation of plans and policies to deliver them that isn't good enough. And as part of that, sectoral implementation. Again, that's something that's clear in the Glasgow Climate Pact in terms of some of its language around coal phase out, fossil fuel subsidy phase down, in terms of the role of abating methane and non-CO2 gases, in terms of the role of ecosystems and nature restoration. And we thought building on those sectoral approaches would be useful, and I can touch on that in a bit more detail later. We also thought it would be important for it to cover many levels, not just global, but national, regional levels, subnational levels. We really thought about an all-hands-on-deck approach to this, and I think that sense of urgency and sense of collaboration would be useful. Finally, we also thought it would be most effective as an annual cycle through to 2030, and having a very dynamic process that can be reviewed and changed over time to suit needs, it being informed by the process and in turn changing how it unfolds so that it's most effective. So that was kind of the first starting point. In terms of how it relates to the annual high-level ministerial, we really viewed the ministerial as an accountability checkpoint. It's a place where parties can demonstrate and be held accountable for their actions and how they are addressing gaps on ambition and implementation. And it also means that it becomes a action forcing moment. And we think that's something that the UNFCCC sometimes does best. It can't force anyone to do action, but the transparency and having 190 plus countries all together motivates people to do more, and it holds people's feet to the fire, and we think that role is really important going forward. In terms of a sectoral approach, there's a few elements to this, but we thought that sectoral dialogues between parties and non-state actors could really be a valuable approach. It's something that takes place in many other forums. We see it at SEM Mission Innovation, as Alden was mentioning, and we see it in a number of other plurilateral alliances and coalitions for driving action, whether it's the Power and Plus Coal Alliance, whether it's new declarations on zero-emission vehicles and the Energy Transitions Commission that the COP26 presidency has set up. But how can we start to build those in the UNFCCC system and make them dock in? And a process of sectoral dialogues that can develop recommendations and roadmaps for delivering on sectoral commitments, and importantly, their role in enhancing and contributing to the delivery of 2030 NDCs, we thought could be a valuable addition. And again, there's various ways in which we could build on, what sectors to cover in that, in terms of those mentioned in the Glasgow Climate Pact, but also, of course, in the IPCC reports. We also thought it would be really important that it brings in line ministries, and so many of the negotiations that take place here, it's climate negotiators. They aren't necessarily the ones who are responsible for delivering the plans and policies that can achieve those targets. They're not sitting in transport departments, in finance ministries, in ministries of agriculture and nature. So whether it could start to build a dialogue with those actors, we thought that would be useful. So we envisaged a number of workshops running up to the high-level ministerial, and really trying to use this process to get parties to think through how they can enhance and integrate sectoral action into their NDCs across sectors, potentially, either recommunicating NDCs and using the opportunity of the high-level ministerial to do that, or modifying them and using NDCs as a log for their sectoral ambition and implementation. Fourth, when we thought about a sectoral approach, it inevitably involves non-state actors. It's kind of nonsensical to talk about sectoral decarbonisation without talking about the people who are doing it, whether that's subnational actors, whether that's private sector, whether that's civil society holding people to account for their implementation plans. And so we really wanted to think through how that could be done, and we're particularly interested in the idea of bringing in the high-level champions and trying to understand what role they could play, because of course they have a huge presence in terms of non-state actor, in terms of championing non-state actor ambition, but they do feel quite distant from the negotiated world, and how can we bring those into the process? When we're talking about sectoral implementation, we're also talking about finance and actual finance to deliver decarbonisation. It doesn't make sense to not think about finance and support to actually get sectoral decarbonisation going. So another element that we were thinking through in this report was around processes to support parties to build investment plans around their NDCs, and trying to view NDCs as investable national level planning documents that could serve as a basis for attracting and crowding in further public and private investment. And we also thought that this process could usefully start to look at the gaps in provision and support, not necessarily driving not necessarily kind of closing the gaps on those, but more just allowing a process for countries and others to understand where their inadequacies are and how we can start to close them. Last of all, we talked in this paper about the design of better NDCs, and it's often said that it's not just the quantity of NDCs we have, but it's the quality of them and how useful they are as a tool to structure climate policy and to deliver on ambition. And we thought, there's a number of existing processes out there. There's the NDC partnership, there's the UNDP Climate Promise Programme, but what else can be done, and could we have processes and dialogues that would be able to assess and recommend improvements on these support structures to take that forward? So those were the 6 kind of pillars of ideas that we thought back in March. Obviously, many more ideas have been brought forward since then, both at the negotiations and from groups like Can International and Fernanda's work there, and C2ES and Kaveh's work there, and many other places are starting to kind of think through what this looks like. So I'm really looking forward to a discussion today that can build on this. And I think my final question would be around, and one thing we perhaps didn't touch on this report, is the relationship of the mitigation work programme to the global stocktake, as Alden mentioned, and I think that's what Marine will talk about next. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom, and we are going to go now to Marine, and I suggest we hold questions for the first panel till all 3 of them have presented. So if you have a question for Tom, write it down. And Marine, you want to come up here, or you want to stay where you are? The other way is fine.
Well, let's have 4.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Marine, and as it was said, I'm working for the Climate Action Network France as a policy advisor for global climate governance, and I'm also coordinating with other colleagues such as Tom the work we are doing at Can International on the global stocktake, but also with other constituencies. I don't want to take too much the spotlight from the mitigation work program, so I'm just giving a few thoughts on how these 2 processes could be complementary. So maybe just to share with you our views on the global stocktake. So as you know, it's the evaluation mechanism of the Paris Agreement, as Alden said earlier. So for us, it's really the guarantee to know how, if we are on 1.5 and what are the gaps, and you will tell me, yeah, we know that already, we are not on track, and we know there are gaps, and we pretty much know where they are. Now, the added value of the global stocktake is that we have a forward-looking approach. It's bringing solutions, and it's bringing maybe ideas and priorities that parties, but also non-state actors can consider to having a more ambitious NDC. So that's actually, to us, the added value, and that's maybe this is an opportunity for us to be sure that all possible aspects of the Paris Agreement are really evaluated. So it's about mitigation, it's about adaptation, it's about finance, it's about capacity building, loss and damage, human rights, ecosystems protection. So it's really extremely large. Now, this is a point where we could see a difference with the mitigation work program, because it's about mitigation, obviously. Even if we have some cross-cutting issues such as finance, that is something that might be a difference. But at the same time, it's a complementary effect, because discussions that are happening on the mitigation work program, maybe also the sectoral discussions that can happen can definitely be great inputs for the global stocktake. The global stocktake might not have all the time we need to go in depth, of everything. And if we have the mitigation work program working next to this, with also non-state actors contributing, I guess this is an extremely important and very valued input that the mitigation work program to provide to the global stocktake. Also considering that the two processes are trying to be very inclusive and to have the solutions from the ground, and that's a huge opportunity. It's not happening very often that we have this kind of format, so let's use them and make them complementary. Maybe on the timing, it's also interesting to see that, so as you know, the global stocktake will happen next year. And with the mitigation work program, we have the possibility, if it's for this decade really, to really have inputs and synergies for 2 GSTs next year and the one between 2025 and 2030. So again, we have a timing, we have 1 decade to be on track. So I don't think we might have so many opportunities to have great discussions. And we have here 2 programs or 2 processes that can be used to really get on action. Like, it's about implementation. It's about what do we need to do tomorrow and after tomorrow. So let's use actually these great opportunities. So maybe to finish on my quick intervention, all in all, I see the 2 processes are as key to reach out ambition for everyone. As I said, parties, but also non-parties. And maybe it's interesting to finish by saying that on this accountability question, I don't know if you noticed, but I'm working on accountability since few years. And 2 years earlier, maybe, when I was coming on this, we didn't have so much reactions from other observers, but also parties. And now everyone is trying to work on how can we create climate accountability? How can we be sure that what is promised is really implemented? And actually, we are talking right now about the credibility of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. And if we don't face that, and if we don't find solutions to create accountabilities for parties and non-parties on their engagement for climate, we will not achieve the Paris Agreement, but we will also lose credibility of this whole process, where we are all sticking energy, I guess, and hope. So I would really see also this as a common goal for the mitigation work program, as well as the GST, creating more accountability spaces so that we can legitimate climate action over the world. I would stop there and pass the floor to Alden. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Maureen. And now we hear from Jamal, who's going to talk about where we stand at the beginning of week 2, coming out of the discussions amongst parties in week 1 and the work of the co-facilitators. Jamal?
Thank you so much, Alden, and hi everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for coming. As Alden said, what I will do today is basically do a quick recap of what we've heard from parties in the first week of the negotiations under the mitigation work program. So the mitigation work program was sort of agreed by parties back in Glasgow, and the SBs here, I mean, this intersession is the first opportunities where parties have come forward with different ideas on how they think the mitigation work program or the topics that the mitigation work program could address. So for the past week, they have been tasked with the idea that parties would come forward to discuss the different guiding principles for the mitigation work programs. What are the modalities? What's the scope? What's the timeline? What are the different institutional arrangements that can take place? And what's the relationship of the mitigation work program to the global stocktake? And what we've seen from the first week of negotiations is that parties are coming forward with very clear ideas of what they want out of the mitigation work program. However, those ideas are quite divergent. There are quite different views from parties of what the mitigation work program could actually achieve. So what I will do is basically lay out some of the main ideas that have come forward from parties on the different elements that they were supposed to discuss. So first, the guiding principles. We've heard several parties put forward that the work program would need to be based on the principles of equity and common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Those were particularly put forward by several parties in developing countries. Other ideas on the guiding principles is that the mitigation work program would be informed by science. And we've also heard under the guiding principles on who would take the lead in terms of the mitigation work program. So different parties have put forward different views. Some said that developed countries, those who are historically responsible for climate change, would take the lead on the mitigation work program. Others said that major emitting countries, those with the largest share of global greenhouse gas emissions, would take the lead in terms of scaling up mitigation ambition and implementation in this critical decade. In terms of the objective, the Glasgow Pact was very clear in terms of what the objective is of the mitigation work program, and that is to scale up mitigation ambition and implementation in this critical decade. Certain parties have pushed for a more ambitious objective, and that is that this mitigation work program would aim to close the current gap that we have, the current large gap, I must say, between where NDCs are heading and where we need to be under the long-term temperature goals of the Paris Agreement. Other parties on the other side referred that the emissions gap should be addressed, in fact, in the global stocktake process and not in the mitigation work program process. So those are some of the main ideas that were put out there. Next is the scope, which is probably the most important element. What would the mitigation, what would be the scope of the mitigation work program? What is the approach? What would it lean into? And here we have, I'm going to present two main ideas that emerged last week. On one side, parties proposed that in order for the mitigation work program to fulfill its objective, and that is to spur mitigation ambition and implementation at the scale and the pace that is needed, it has to adopt a sectoral or a thematic approach, building on sectors that were identified in the Glasgow Pact that Tom mentioned, whether it's the phase down of coal or the phase out of fossil fuel subsidies, focus on non-CO2 gases such as methane, work on ecosystems and nature. And this would, as has been iterated here, would have implications on finance and support, would also have implications on just transition. So it's not really just about, the phase out of certain sectors, but it also has these elements of finance and just transition that we also care a lot about. On the other side, there was the idea that the mitigation work program would offer a platform for exchange on barriers and challenges, and then also best practices and lessons learned, and would have a focus on the implementation of NDCs. So this was also proposed that the mitigation work program would be the platform for countries to come and exchange ideas on those challenges and best practices. Next is really the timeline, and the Glasgow Pact does not strictly specify what would be the timeline of the mitigation work program. However, we did hear different ideas on what that timeline could be. Some parties said that the mitigation work program would run up until 2030, basically, until the objective of the mitigation work program is fulfilled. Other ideas that emerged is that the mitigation work program would have a focused plan over the next 2 or 3 years, and then there would be moments in the future to assess the progress that the mitigation work program has done. And just in terms of, if we remember from the Glasgow Pact and what countries agreed to, is that a draft decision would be adopted, that there would be a recommendation for a draft decisions that may be adopted by parties at COP27. And obviously we do want to see that outcome. And so in terms of what the work that would, need to happen from this sessions here in Bonn up and all the way up to COP27, there were also some different ideas, and those were that there would be intersessional workshops and in-person workshops, a call for submissions from parties, under the mitigation work program, and other groups said that, or basically deferred to no workshops or any intersessional meetings on the way to COP27. So. All of those ideas, obviously, as I said, were emerged last week. In terms of what happened in the last session, basically parties also quite highlighted or prioritized that the mitigation work program would have to have a clear link to the global stocktake so that we ensure that no work is duplicated. In fact, it would be complementary as suggested by the Glasgow Climate Pact. Of course, what we expect next is, there has been an information note that was circulated by the co-facilitators that really summarized all of these different ideas that we heard from parties, and parties did have the opportunity to actually reflect on some of these elements. And as I said, they really prioritized the question of relation to the global stocktake. But then also we heard some feedback on the uses of words such as, specifying who the group of parties that need to take the lead on the mitigation work program. So, for example, whether it would be major emitting parties, that was one issue that was raised. What we expect next is another iteration of this information note from the co-facilitators. This is something that we haven't received yet, but it is meant to respond to some of the feedback that we've heard from parties. If I am to end, there's obviously, as I said, quite a big gap, and we only have 10 years to get ourselves on path to 1.5 degrees C. Otherwise, we are facing catastrophic sort of consequences of climate change. And we obviously, this mitigation work program does offer us the opportunity that, it offers the opportunity of having a governance sort of, or a process within the UNFCCC to push for more ambitious climate action and ambition as part of the negotiation, the negotiations that happen under the UNFCCC. So. We would obviously look forward to see quite an ambitious, sort of scope and role for this mitigation work program. It is quite important that we push for that. And, in terms of next steps, what parties can do is really try and come together and develop this shared understanding of what this ambitious, approach for the mitigation work program could look like. And there has also to be engagement between parties amongst each other so that, we would bridge some of the divergent views that we've heard from parties. And it would also be quite helpful in terms of shaping the mitigation work program to really define and hear from parties how do they view sort of the relationship between the mitigation work program and the global stocktake. Having that sort of long-term vision or having that, clarity of the relationship between the two could really help advance some of the work under both processes, whether the global stocktake or the mitigation work program. So with this, I hope I gave this, quick recap and would look forward to your question and the discussion. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, Jamal. So I think the bottom line is the outlook is cloudy. We had a good first week in terms of countries putting positions on the table, but then we saw some tension in the room, particularly in the last session, and it's now down to the co-facilitators to decide what kind of text they want to put forward and where they want to propose parties go for the rest of this week. So you've heard from Tom on sort of laying out a comprehensive overall vision for what an ambitious mitigation ambition work program would look like. You heard Maureen talk about some of the dynamics and the interaction between the work program and the GST, and you heard Jamal give an update on the negotiating state of play. So let's see if there's questions for the first three speakers from anyone before we bring up the second panel. Anything you'd like to ask Tom, Maureen, or Jamal? Just raise your hand and we can ask a question. There's a microphone here, so wait for the mic to come to you. Anyone want to break the ice? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Lucona. I am part of a youth international NGO called Care About Climate that has a NDC equity tracker, where we track countries' NDC progress and analyze them through youth, gender, and indigenous perspective. Therefore, my question is, we already have civil society organizations that work relentlessly to raise awareness and advocate for bolder NDCs, but how do we bridge the gap to make sure our demands are heard from governments? Because we already support the design of better NDCs, as I see on your PowerPoint presentation, but how are we making sure that our demands are heard and the governments are held accountable on it? Thank you.
Wonderful question to the panel. Anyone can come in on that. How do we ensure that the best design mitigation work program actually delivers the goods in terms of building some expectations that countries will increase their ambition, both on their headline targets and maybe implementation of their commitments and sectoral initiatives? Anyone want to take a first crack at that? Tom? You? Yeah?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the first thing that popped into my head was maybe quite process-based, but I think one of the exciting outcomes from the Glasgow Climate Pact was also its elements on youth and kind of having this ongoing youth summit. I can't remember if it's a pre-COP mandated event or if it's a youth ministerial. I'd have to double check. But I'm already starting to think, can there be a better process for docking into that and formalizing and strengthening the role of that, so it's not a tokenistic, oh look, we've had an event on youth, but really integrates and mainstreams it into the process somehow. It's something I haven't considered before, but maybe an idea worth thinking through more.
And you mentioned accountability. We do have this high-level experts panel that the Secretary General appointed, chaired by former Minister Catherine McKenna of Canada, which is examining accountability and delivery of non-state actors, subnational mitigation ambition, and of course trying to make sure it's not greenwashing, promising net zero commitments in 2050, and then as the old joke goes, the guy says, I will stop drinking in 2049 and go sober in 2050. But we, in this process, we have a new transparency regime, which we have agreed now, which really enters into full effect in 2024. We have some existing processes of multilateral consultative processes for countries to receive questions, primarily from other parties. Some of us have been involved in expert review panels that have gone in and done a technical analysis of particularly developed countries' mitigation ambition and done an independent review under this process. But really the accountability in this process is pressure that governments feel from their own people, from their own business leaders, from youth, from labor leaders, from their parliaments, the general public. And I think if it's successful, this mitigation work program can bring to light positive examples of how some countries are leaping ahead, taking advantage of all the reductions in technology costs, the support that they're getting from states and cities and businesses. And that will frankly put a little pressure on the laggard countries to keep up as their citizens see what other countries are doing and want them to do their fair share. So there is no compliance regime in this process other than the requirement to submit an NDC and then report on how well you're doing in achieving it. There's no penalty if you don't achieve it, as there would have been in the Kyoto Protocol, even though that penalty was not very significant in terms of motivating behavior. But that really is the answer here. It's showcasing best practices, demonstrating to the world how much more has to be done and who's doing what, and hopefully having that pressure build from the bottom up in each country. Additional questions for this panel before we bring up the second panel? Anyone else have a question? Anything on the state of play for Jamal and sort of what to expect in the next 3 days, or anything from Marine on how the technical dialogue on the GST may affect any of this? Yeah, there we go.
Hi there, my name is Tom Mitchell. I work for Climate Kick, an EU innovation agency. So just taking a kind of delivery and practitioner perspective, Climate Kick is working with 112 cities across Europe through the EU Cities Mission to achieve net zero by 2030. So in terms of the challenges that we're encountering together with those cities, one of the most important is about speed and flexibility of finance. And at the moment, I think the concern we have is a 2030 set of targets, which after all is going to be 7 years away by the time we get to this. In some of the instruments we use, the access to finance takes several years and there are multiple layers of bureaucracy. And so my question to the panel is, what more could we do through a mitigation work program to look at not just the volume of finance available, but actually changing the rules and the speed with which that can be accessed? Be interested in the panel's comments, because that's the real challenge on the ground.
Any thoughts about transforming speed and access to finance? Because as he pointed out, we only have basically 7 years left at this point before we hit that 2030 deadline. Marine, Jamal, you want to take a crack? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks a lot for that question. It's a very important. The finance element of the mitigation, process is quite crucial. And as we know that there is quite a gap in terms of not just the access to finance, but also the finance itself. I mean, we don't have the money, that is enough to spur that change. And here, developed countries have the obligation to provide that finance, or have more responsibility to provide that finance to developing countries, to transform their sectors, to act more on climate change. So, obviously, as part of increasing that finance, there has to be the increase of the efficiency of how parties can access those finance. And we've heard from quite a lot of parties the challenges for that, especially for small island developing states. And it's an interesting question. There's it's obviously a problem, and it has to be sort of addressed. But it sits within a broader context of not just it's the amount of money that is dedicated to certain countries, the amount of money that goes to mitigation versus adaptation. So, we are faced with all of these problems, and I'm not sure how much does a mitigation work program can actually comment on that, but it's certainly something that is quite a priority and needs to be addressed, either hinted or nudged towards in this mitigation work program and addressed in other processes. But so that would be my response there.
Yeah, I mentioned the need to scale up by a factor of 7 the flows of finance if we're really going to transform particularly the global south sectors, but also the global north by 2030. And of course, we had this paradox in Glasgow where we had Mark Carney and the GFANZ initiative saying there's $130 trillion available to decarbonize the planet, and yet we can't meet the $100 billion goal. We're behind on that. So obviously there's a disconnect there, and we need mechanisms to accelerate flows from that asset pool that presumably is available. And there's a lot of work going on to think about how you can use things like regional risk guarantee platforms in South Asia or Southeast Asia to basically take some of the risk out of the private sector flows and really unlock some of that $130 trillion. But it's complicated work. It means changing the way the World Bank does business. It means changing the way the private sector banks do business. A lot of those companies in the GFANZ coalition, they're pledging to be net zero in 2050, and yet they're still 2 or 3 to 1 investing in fossil fuels over clean energy in the near term. So again, there's time frames matter. Anyone else want to comment on that before I bring up the second panel? Tom, did you want to say something on finance?
Yeah, I can speak to it quickly. I mean, I think my first reflection would be, it's interesting to explore how the mitigation work program, like what's the kind of added value that it can play? Like what's the barrier that it can unlock, recognizing that it's a UNFCCC process. And it's, obviously it's not going to be able to do the financial transformation itself, that those actions lie elsewhere. But what can it usefully do in terms of, we've talked about kind of building understanding of best practice and knowledge exchange, identifying barriers and overcoming them, and then building an understanding at that kind of global level that then can filter down to cities, to kind of the actors that are relevant. And yeah, I'd definitely kind of welcome your thoughts on, what is the actual barrier there that could be resolved at a global level, but which could then filter down to where it needs to go. I think the other thing that it could do is, if we understand it as yet another process through which we can shape decisions at COPs, because it will have, if it were a program along the lines that we'd envisaged, there would be workshops, recommendations, it would be something that builds towards the high-level ministerial that could be adopted by ministers, or even, then inform, ministers could consider that and then say, there's a gap here, and we need to send a political signal in a COP process that can then tell the relevant international institutions or bodies, this is where we're going wrong and this is what we need to do. Yeah, I guess the disadvantage of the inefficiency is that it does tend to operate at the level of signals sometimes, especially on issues like finance. But yeah, that's kind of my sense of where it could go. But I'd definitely be interested to explore it further.
Yeah, and I think we need to do some more deep thinking about the linkage between the new mitigation work program and some of the existing processes in the system. If done right, the mitigation work program could help inform the post-2025 collective finance goal that's now being negotiated, at least on the mitigation side. It could also inform some of the discussions the Standing Committee on Finance will have around operationalization of the Article 2.1c need to shift financial flows in both the public and private sector. And I've been told there's 15 or 20 different finance agenda items on the agenda for COP26. So to the extent that mitigation ambition program can surface some of the needs from the people that are requiring the finance, whether the developing countries or the private sector, and then figure out how other parts of this process can help unlock and match some of those needs. I think we need a lot more creative thinking there. So please join me in giving the first panel a round of applause, and we'll bring up the second panel. And Fernanda and Jonas and Kaveh, come on up. Two slides, right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So we're going to start with Kaveh, who's got a couple of slides to run through and his thoughts about where this is and some of the challenges and opportunities. And then, as I said, we'll hear from Fernanda, who's been leading the Civil Society Climate Action Network Mitigation Ambition Working Group. And finally, we'll bring up Jonas to give us sort of a negotiator's perspective from someone working with a minister who helped drive this process forward to a decision in Glasgow. So Kaveh, come on up, and I'll see if I can tee up your slide.
Thanks, Alden. I'm happy to speak from here, if that's okay.
Okay.
I've only got 2 slides, so. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's really an honour and a pleasure, and E3G have been doing some really excellent work in this, so I'm happy to be able to maybe add a little bit of value. It's hard also to follow the 3 previous speakers because they've essentially said everything that I wanted to say. But as ever in this process, the more often you say something that's useful, the bigger the chance of getting there. So I think what I wanted to do was touch briefly on the issue of progress in the negotiations. I think there's good things and slightly not so good things about where we are, picking up on what was said by earlier speakers. So first of all, I think it's very encouraging that parties are really engaging, and maybe you need to have been in this process for years, like Alden and I, to pick up on the subtleties, but parties are genuinely engaging and there are important messages coming through. And I think it's also encouraging that the co-facilitators so far have been able to capture ideas. Anyone who's been around for a while will know that we've sometimes spent entire negotiating sessions discussing whether or not we can write down what people have said on a document, even if it has no status. So this is progress, which I think also reflects the urgency of the task at hand and that things are shifting accordingly. I think at the same time, there are some concerns emerging. One is that I think we need to make sure that we stick to the mandate that's coming out that we had from Glasgow, and also that we don't seek to amend the text of the Paris Agreement. So I think there's parties having some concerns that they're expressing that the mitigation work programme shouldn't amend what we've already agreed. But also we do need to make sure that it's not just a talking shop and that we actually deliver something. So I think the next slide, please, Alden, and the last slide. So going a little bit into more detail, I think that those concerns that parties have could be addressed in a number of ways, particularly, I think, by placing the mitigation work programme squarely in the context of the wider process. And again, the previous speakers touched on this. So I think I'd like to raise probably 6 points very quickly. First of all, on this issue, the mitigation work programme has to be more than a talk shop, so it has to deliver. It was agreed in the context of the Glasgow outcome that really emphasised the urgency, and for that reason, I think it has to link to the political process, in particular the mitigation roundtables, and that's up in the air at the moment. So that's something that we need to secure. Secondly, I think it's important that we recall that the mandate of the mitigation work programme is to complement the global stocktake, and I see that as meaning that it adds to and it adds value, but it doesn't change. And I think by emphasising that, we can give some parties comfort that we're not seeking to amend the Paris Agreement. So again, Alden and others have touched on this, but the global stocktake, in theory, it impacts the update of NDCs in 2025, and actually we'll be looking at NDCs beyond 2030, whereas the mitigation work programme is squarely within the context of the critical decade, so pre-2030. Also, we've heard the global stocktake is comprehensive in all areas, but it operates in the silos of mitigation, adaptation, finance. The mitigation work programme needs to clearly focus on mitigation and can bring in other areas such as sectoral approaches and others. But also, I think that a vision could emerge whereby, and again, the previous speakers spoke about this, the mitigation work programme can identify near-term opportunities and generate commitments on a shorter timescale, political commitments, but these could then be harvested within the context of the 5-year cycle through updated NDCs. We are not going to end up in a situation where we have a 1-year NDC cycle. It's just not going to happen. Any serious government needs longer than that to put in place policies and make international commitments, but the mitigation work programme could secure political commitments that are then held accountable and harvested. The third thing I would say that I'm hearing is that many parties are saying, or emphasising the importance of sharing best practice on domestic policy making. Article 4.2 does have a legally binding requirement for parties to put in place policies to implement the NDC. They have to try to do that. They don't necessarily have to succeed, but they have to try. And Article 4.2 was emphasised in Glasgow, and I think having a focus on opportunities, on implementation and collaboration will be important within the mitigation work programme, and it will build confidence and build momentum. The fourth point I would say is that the mitigation work programme needs to involve non-party stakeholders in the work of the climate champions, including to break down those silos that we have in other areas and really bring in innovation. Fifthly, and this is a bit of a curveball, and people for Alden's experience and others in the audience, it strikes me that there is a standing agenda item that's contentious where other UN bodies, particularly the IMO and ICAO, report to the UNFCCC or don't report. I'm not sure what the status of that agenda item is, but I would have thought that these important sectors should feed into the mitigation work programme, essential sectors which will blow our budget towards 1.5 if they're not part of the solution. And then the last thing I would say is it's a nice conversation we're having, and the co-facilitators will informally capture the conversation, but we need a decision coming out of COP27, and we have not started any negotiations at all. This is going to be a difficult issue at COP27 to agree, even though it's only a process decision, but we have to have intersessional work between now and COP27. We need a submissions process. We need to have intersessional informal meetings to make progress and to think about a novel approach. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kaveh. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. We're not going to come out of here perhaps as far along as we had hoped with a draft decision text to work on. So we are going to have to use submissions, technical consultations, head of delegation meetings convened by the incoming presidency and other tools to try to catch up before we arrive in Sharm el-Sheikh. On your point number 5 on IMO and ICAO, I think this is obviously important. It's also a challenge. My favorite, sort of in an ironic sense, my favorite headline after Paris was in an obscure publication called Shipping News, and it read in its entirety, historic climate agreement reached in Paris, shipping unaffected. Now, that kind of says it all with the IMO and their attitude towards this process, I think. So we do need to figure out how to bring on these other processes. Now, there are processes outside here with a lot more energy. Clean Energy Ministerial, Mission Innovation, the Coalition for Climate and Clean Air, the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action, the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, which Denmark hosted an event on upstairs earlier today. So there's all kinds of external processes, and of course it always gets a little prickly when you recognize and bring in some and you don't bring in others, and sometimes you get challenges about the relevance of some of these policies. Some of you remember the debate a couple of years ago about whether we would welcome or take note of the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees that all governments had requested the IPCC to deliver. So these things sometimes can get a little tricky. So Fernanda, over to you. What's your thinking about how we should be looking at this from a civil society? You're on the ground in Brazil, a very easy geography with a very pliable and responsive government. So how can the mitigation work program help civil society groups on the ground who are fighting for increased ambition?
Well, yeah, I think that when we did our collective thinking at CAN, and it's a pleasure to be here among distinguished colleagues, negotiators, and I am a little bit in this process for a while, not a dinosaur as you, but maybe a baby dinosaur. He says that, I'm not saying it. So.
He does. I'm Jurassic.
Yeah.
Kaveh is Cretaceous, so, you know,
it's very interesting to see, you know, how we have grown also and how we're able to share experiences and do brainstorming around key processes, such as the mitigation working program. So to me, there are some premises to this, which is some of the things that my colleagues already mentioned, but I think it's important to highlight that we don't see this creating any new obligations or amending the Paris Agreement. It's all about the commitments in the Paris Agreement. We think equity and common but differentiated responsibilities should be at the center of this process. And I also think it's very important to mention that when we talk about mitigation, I've heard from some colleagues and many times that this is a process that is mitigation-centric, and we should look at adaptation and loss and damage, but I think there is a key contribution of this program to mitigation and loss and damage. The least mitigation we do, the more we'll need to do on the loss and damage side, and the most expensive will be. And we know that the IPCC made it very clear that there are limits to adaptation. And I think that also another premise, and a sad one, is that this program exists because the first ratchet cycle didn't go as expected. And the parties recognized that in the Glasgow Pact decision. And it's very hard to say, but you know, climate impacts that could derive from that are even harder. So that's an opportunity for us to try to correct course. So more specifically about your question on civil society, I think that the so-called non-state parties or non-party stakeholders, non-state actors, they have been having experiencing longer than this process on a sectoral approach, which is something that should be at the heart of those programs. And there are lessons to be shared. There is a lot of learning there. And as I mentioned already, a sectoral approach is key. And it's anchored in the text of the Glasgow Pact for the energy sector, as my colleagues have already mentioned, for protecting ecosystem, when the text mentions also the other non-GHG gases. There have been some initiatives too. Those initiatives, for example, the sectoral initiatives from the UK presidency, the initiatives from the champions, those are all contributing to reduce emissions. And we need reduction of emissions everywhere. That's all welcome. But we also need accountability, and we need a way to report on this. And this program could be a venue for that too. And in the relation with the GST, I think that how I see it is that the GST, of course, is a complementary and equally important process. And we wouldn't need the program, as I already mentioned, if the cycle was working fine. We could only rely on the GST. But the truth is that the decisive decade is now 8 years. And it's urgent. I mean, if we want to stay below 1.5, we need to take action now. Action and implementation, ambition and implementation. So implementation, we'll have to tackle that while we discuss how to enhance ambition. And we see this program also as an enabling environment, non-punitive or not target setting, but creating the conditions. And the IPCC mentioned in the Working Group 3 report the 6 enabling conditions for countries to have the opportunity to enhance their ambition. And of course, when we talk about common but differentiated responsibilities, we know that developed countries have to do more, have to provide means of implementation, of course, on finance, capacity building, technology transfer, and developing countries can also benefit for that. If they don't take on the sectoral transformation, they will suffer in the real economy. So it's an opportunity for all, of course. And we want, I don't know, we as civil society, we think that the mind shift should change, because this is actually an opportunity to do things right, is an opportunity to exchange experiences, to build new benchmarks, to promote a virtual cycle that will put us on a pathway to 1.5. And I always like to say that 1.5 is also no paradise. There are impacts, and there will be impacts in this threshold. So I think that's also very important to highlight, that this program has to have a relationship with these other processes and initiatives that I already mentioned. We believe that it should run till 2030. And I think that, one key point that I think I would make is that this shouldn't be just a technical exercise of discussing targets and percentages. We should discuss also what is the political purpose. This is also a political exercise. So we want to see this program being discussed, for example, in the Petersburg dialogue, and having the involvement of ministers, not only in the high-level ministerials, but the line ministers, because those are the ones who will have to deal with implementation at the end of the day. I think I'll stop here by now, so we have a chance to hear from our other colleagues, and maybe a second round I can exchange more ideas. Over.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you very much. So Jonas, you and your minister were deeply engaged in the consultations in the run-up to Glasgow that produced this decision. For it to deliver on what your vision and the vision of the ministers you consulted with were, what would it have to do? What would we have to do here? What would we have to do in Sharm el-Sheikh? How would we live into the impulse that you and Minister Jorgensen and the minister from Grenada really drove?
Yeah, so thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me today. I'm very happy to be here with all of you. I have this used car salesman picture up there. I'm so sorry. But if you want to buy a car, come see me later.
As long as it's a Zoe.
Yeah.
Was a consultant on that, but anyway. No. Anyway, I think that marine really put it very succinctly when she talked about credibility, right? And so credibility about the process. And credibility about the process is about implementation. And so that's really what it's about, obviously, implementation. I think for anyone, and I'm sure that we've all been in these processes and related UN processes for a number of years, and if we tally it all up, it'll probably be like 2,000 years collectively in here, right? So I think every year is obviously about implementation. Every time we go through a major conference, the year after, it's about implementation. But I think the way we attacked it, and we thought about it for quite some time also when we approached the task before COP, but also after COP, is also that we need to look at how we do things differently. So obviously implementation, ambition are keywords, but for us also, it's also a way of looking at how we can change the way we work. And so I think that the fundamental question here is, not only is that how we drive the change, but how do we get at the systems change that we want? And I think that this work program is not a silver bullet, but it does provide a platform and a gear shift of sorts to try something new. So I think that Tom also laid it out very succinctly. I think he and the report and the work you've done has just really have been a great contribution to this process. But I think we are looking at an opportunity to make things happen. So I think my hope here is also that we will use this process to influence decision makers from all sectors, really, to drive more action. I think Tom looked at some of the sectors, and I think we base also a lot of our approach on the sectoral approach. Because I think to some extent it provides a space for governments to share plans and perhaps even explain how NDCs are 1.5 compatible. But it could also be a space to discuss synthesis reports and how short-term action is connected to long-term goals, of course, while being firmly grounded in the IPCC and science. But the real driver, and again, just also going back to a lot of the work that Tom has done, is this sectoral approach. And that's also something that we talked a lot about at COP26, and very happy to see it embedded in the decision. So these sectors, and I'm just includes obviously the upscaling of renewables and energy efficiency and the coal phase down and fossil fuel subsidies and so on, but again signals a potential new way forward. And I think the question that we're also asking us is if we can base discussions in the work program on perhaps not limited to, but at least based on those sectors. And can they serve as platforms to concretely discuss with all stakeholders? So we have civil societies and private sector governments. You also brought it up, Alden, and Kaveh and Fernanda, also how we bring in the coalitions and how we bring in other UN processes, right? We have the SDGs. We don't want to reinvent them also, but we want to find a way of how we can look at how we bring them into the platforms, this work program. And obviously the high-level champions, because there's a lot of work also done there. We need to use the platform then to look at where we need to go and what's happening out there. And perhaps also more importantly, what's not happening. The potential of making it happen, and who needs to be involved and how we can do that. And I think that's also to go to one of the previous questions also and looking at, I think there's a value in using this program also in initiating the conversations on the barriers. And so having the different stakeholders look at what are the barriers. I think somebody asked about the financial side, right? And so what are the regulations that need to change? I'm just a civil servant, and so a lot of times my expertise is not within the problems that the financial sector sees. And so what are those? Can we use this platform to draw out those and start that conversation on what we as government perhaps needs to look at?
Yeah.
And obviously in doing so, the hope is that it will add to not only action, but also some transparency of efforts. I think a lot has been said on the accountability side. We're not looking at a new ETF or something to that extent, but simply by showing what's been going on and document it, I think will go a long way in also contributing to the transparency efforts. I think Fernanda also addressed the need to look at how we ensure support. And so that will obviously be an element that was also part of the Climate Pact also. And then obviously the forward-looking, pragmatic approach, looking at the positive examples. And in thus doing, then trying to see how we get everyone involved. Again, I want to stress, I don't think this is a silver bullet, but it's part and parcel of a process, right? And so the link to the other processes that we'll need to include are for me obvious. So the work program can help identify the areas that can inform ministers and decision makers. And so that's also where the link to the roundtable comes in. We need that link to a political level. So and vice versa, obviously, feedback from ministers and political level. And give guidance to the work program. Also, perhaps the roundtable can help set out the direction and identify new areas and sectors. Those are just suggestions, obviously, but those are the things that have come to mind. Because in doing so, I think we can support also the developments that are underway in the GST. Obviously, there is a difference in time perspective between the work program and the GST, but we do hope that, for instance, in also looking at new ways of working, we can also talk about new ways that will help the GST and the things that come out of there.
Yep.
So how do we, again, see the work program? I think that if you're looking at the current text on the table, I think it's a jumble of a lot of things. But it's a useful step forward. Thematic dialogues, workshops, and so on really sounds extremely boring. And I guess, again, that's what we excel at from the civil service. But my point is, we can call it a lot of things, right? The point is, these are platforms where we can get together and talk about some of the barriers. But I think it's also important that we also create an impetus to go beyond those platforms then and create the structures that will enable this to be taken further outside of the UNFCCC, because that's really where the action is happening, right?
Yeah.
And so I think just on the negotiations, I'm not going to delve in too much on that, but I think that, you know, this is a stepwise approach, and this is a new, also conceptually a new item, and so I have been encouraged by the negotiations so far, insofar as we have engaged in substance, right? And we have a document on the table that reflects the discussions. We only have a few days left, so I think that we have a document then that everybody feels comfortable with, and then we can take further on towards Sharm. I think it'll be a positive step forward. But as previous speakers also said, I think there is some homework also to be done towards Sharm. So question is whether or not we'll do that via workshops or the like. That's for the coming process to see. So I think those are my words. Thank you again for inviting me.
Great, thank you very much. And let's see if there's questions for this panel. Suzanne, can we bring the microphone up here in the second row?
Thank you. I'm Susanne Lading from Tagesspiegel in Berlin, and I would like to know more about, you all mentioned several times that sectoral approach is important in this process, and I don't know these NDCs, but there must be sectoral targets as well in some NDCs, at least. Yep. So I didn't get quite where's the what makes the difference of the sectoral approach. Thank you.
Who wants to address that? How the sectoral approach can drive and relate to the NDCs? Kaveh?
I mean, I think we can all speak to that. I mean, first of all, I think Glasgow was groundbreaking in the sense that the decision actually referred to sectors. So it's not as obvious as you may think. So it referred to coal specifically and also fossil fuels, and that was a breakthrough. We also see the work of the non-party stakeholders and the high-level champions increasingly gaining prominence, particularly the latter, their 2030 breakthroughs, the pathways, and that work was well recognized as well in Glasgow. But having said that, we have to remember this is a multilateral process, and I think there's a legitimate concern among some parties, depending on the sector in question, that that multilateral process and national sovereignty around deciding nationally determined contributions, which was settled in Paris, isn't circumvented in this process through a sectoral target setting process, which is subnational and but still transboundary. So I think there's a tension between a sectoral discussion, but also setting sectoral targets. So that's something to think about. But it's important to have that conversation, because for policymakers and non-parties, it's not a question of mitigation, adaptation, means of implementation. Nobody sitting in a ministry at home thinks that way. They think about solutions that touch all sorts of aspects of the economy and society. So we do need to bridge that divide, and I think the mitigation work program could do that, particularly through the work of the champions, would be a very legitimate way of doing that. Thanks.
Fernanda?
Yeah, if I may add to that, I think that, we did an interesting exercise at WWF called The NDCs We Want. Is a qualitative analysis of NDCs. And I read many NDCs, almost all of them so far. And it's a very diverse world that reflects, the diversity of the world. And the different understanding about sectors. Of course, we have the IPCC. And of course, there are different countries with different realities. We know that the energy sector is a big deal for many countries, but for countries, for example, like my country, in Brazil, the biggest reduction of emissions potential is on deforestation or avoiding deforestation, nature, etc. So it's important that this program looks at this diversity that we have and gives strong signals to countries that they will be supported on the different things that they need to do. Of course, we will need to prioritize and start somewhere. And I think it makes sense to start with decarbonizing the energy sector, of course, because of the political geopolitics, the geopolitics situation with the Russia war, of course, and we know that this is the sector where we really need to cut emissions. But it's important to send signals to countries that will tackle other sectors. And I think that, as my colleague mentioned, the experience of the champions and the work with the Marrakesh Partnership is really rich and really important. So there are some solutions that are cost-effective, as the IPCC has also said, that need to be put to the table for countries to build from them and to be supported in the sense. So I think that's the beauty of a sectoral approach. Again, I know it's a hard conversation in the UNFCCC. It took us 29 years to have a mention to the energy sector, but we have this opportunity now in front of us to talk about this.
Yes, back here and then over on the right. Or why don't we start over on the right and then we'll go across. Okay, he's going across. There we go.
Thanks very much, everyone, for this panel. Jason Funk now at Conservation International. Good to see some of you. I'm beginning to get the sense that the work program is the place where we're going to decide sort of who does what when over the coming decade, like picking up on this idea of signals that need to be sent, figuring out sectorally, figuring out regionally, figuring out across developed and developing countries. And there's a great need for that process. So I sort of want to understand if that's what you're saying, is that it's about this who does what when, because we've known since at least the IPCC fourth assessment report, like there's a huge advantage to global coordination on these mitigation efforts. But I also just came from the GST mitigation session earlier today, and you can kind of already see the fights that are going to be teed up about how much should we rely on nature versus how much should we do tech CDR versus how much can we decarbonize these other places. And with all due respect to the great work that's happened in the Jurassic and the Cretaceous, I've only been around since maybe the Pleistocene, so my poor Neanderthal brain can't quite figure out, like, when are we going to actually do that coordination effort? Because we can really see the benefits of it, but I haven't seen it in this process very often so far. So I really welcome the opportunity to do that coordination work and figure out who does what when. We know it's going to involve a lot of deals about mitigation and finance and MOI. So if that's where this is going to happen, if that's what you're saying, then yes, let's do it.
I'm going to suggest we take the other two questions, since we have about 7 or 8 minutes, and then we'll ask the panelists to address whichever ones they want to, Jurassic, Cretaceous, or Pleistocene, right? Okay, good. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jerker and Alden with the conventional wetlands. It follows quite logically on from the previous question, which it's not the question I would have asked, but hopefully would have yielded the answer I wanted. Going to the point of nature in the context of the work program, and coming out of Glasgow, there's finally a really strong signal on nature, lots of focus on forest. There are many other aspects of nature that are important for any opportunity of getting to 1.5, peatlands in particular. And all of this sits in other intergovernmental frameworks that are not the climate convention. And so there are many decisions and processes around that are already in motion, where potential climate outcomes are being had without being fully connected into the climate discourse. And so I guess my question is really about the state of play and the issue of what are the prospects for, within this work program approach, yielding more than perhaps we have done previously in terms of making the different intergovernmental frameworks sort of collectively deliver the things that they individually can't.
Wonderful, thanks. Good question. And the last one up here, Mark. Wait for the microphone, there you go.
I don't know if I'm...
Introduce yourself.
Yeah,
Introduce
Mark
yourself.
With WWF. I don't know if I'm Jurassic or Cretaceous, and I don't even know what order those come in, but I'm probably like the second oldest of whatever all those are. And I also have been following shipping and aviation in this process for a while, and I couldn't pass up a chance to comment on that. I think this process has tried, has kind of dabbled in sectors in different ways over the past few decades. Forests, now agriculture, shipping and aviation were one of the earliest ones, and I really think that's a cautionary tale now, seeing the debates that are happening. They haven't even managed to take note of the reports of ICAO and IMO, and they're fighting now about whether it should also be adaptation, of course, means of implementation, CBDR. Another exercise that we thought was promising at the beginning was the work stream 2, the technical assessment process back around the time of Paris. I think those are maybe two extremes. That process was very technical and non-political, and involved experts making presentations and capturing them in reports. When we actually get into things that can actually have an impact on sectors and emissions and trade and those kinds of things, it very quickly gets political, and maybe sending political messages like the energy decision is the most we can do in some cases. But so I wonder, given this kind of range of experiences, I wonder if there is kind of a sweet spot, or if there's a number of sweet spots for different things for the UNFCCC to be able to contribute something, given that in the views of a lot of people, it's kind of where good ideas go to die. I don't think that, but I've heard that before.
Okay, we've got some great questions. We got a question on, can this process deliver coordination at the sectoral or national level? Can it tap into other processes, particularly on nature? And what are the experiments we've done in the past that might inform what we do in the future and get a different result, I guess is what I'd hear from Mark. How can we learn from the past and not repeat it? Who wants to come in? Why don't we just go right down the line, and each of you can comment on whichever of the questions you want to, and then we'll wrap it up.
Thanks, Alden. I'd like to answer the Mark's question, if I could.
Sure.
I think it's a really good one. We have tried a lot of things in the past, and those of us who remember Workstream 2, I think it's an idea that was ahead of its time, and it happened in the context of Paris negotiations where the focus wasn't there. I think I detect a shift. Actually, when you listen to the nuances of what negotiators are saying in rooms, but more so not in the rooms, in things like the World Cafe, which I think was a wonderful thing. There's a genuine concern about how do we do the stuff we've promised to do, even amongst the major players. In terms of the big emitters, I think there's a real concern, like how do we deliver our commitments towards net zero, whether it's 2050, 2060, 2070. So I think that shift at national level is impacting the way that delegations approach here, and I think the shift towards implementation is important because it would also deliver real benefits for the atmosphere, but also build confidence, because at the moment NDCs are getting more ambitious and emissions are going up. So something's not working, and implementation is key. So in terms of the sweet spot, I think, as you alluded to, we can't deliver ambition in this process. It can basically set signals, and the work is done outside. So the question is, how do you have all of that good stuff that comes in, but then have signals coming out that actually pick the low-hanging fruit and send signals to domestic policymakers? And I think that's the challenge of both the Mitigation Work Programme and the GST. You can't just say, here's a website with 20,000 initiatives, off you go. Most delegations at home in capital have 3 people working on their energy policy, if they're lucky. So I think having those clear signals coming out is really important. But I think there is a shift here, but we can't do all the work here. So it's how this process sends those signals of ambition and target, but also to implementers at home.
Thanks, Kaveh. Fernanda.
Yeah, building on that, I think that for the first question on who does what and when, I agree very much that this is a nice way to frame it. The answer is, again, implementation, and we'll have to kind of measure or benchmark implementation somehow, be it through the transparency framework or another way, but I think that, we'll have synthesis reports on NDCs, synthesis reports on long-term strategies, and we'll have every year a ministerial roundtable that should be a checkpoint for how this is going and how this is landing in NDCs. Because, as you mentioned, Jonas, I think that we need to discuss barriers, but more than discuss barriers, we need to address the barriers, right? Otherwise, it's just a talk shop, and I think this process should deliver real action and reflect this shift to implementation that's not complete. I mean, the pivoting to implementation, the so-called pivoting to implementation. I mean, we cannot do that because the ambition cycle is broken still. We'll need to invest on that. So we have to now look at implementation and ambition as reinforcing processes, and I think the instruments are there for that. I also think, as my colleague said, and that this is not going to solve all the problems of the convention, and we cannot expect that, but we really need this push to reflect the urgency, and we have 8 years to deal with 45% of emissions reductions by 2030, as the IPCC said. On nature, forests, and peatland, and ecosystem protection, this is mentioned under the mitigation section in the Glasgow Pact, and I think that, of course, this program should, I don't know if in a stepwise approach, or as I mentioned, there are countries for which this is a big sector. Of course, this should be an issue under this program, since those ecosystems absorb 54% of the carbon of the atmosphere, as said by the IPCC. If we don't conserve nature, we'll never be able to tackle the problem. So this is really, really important. I don't know if I really answered that, because I don't know all the hows, but I believe in the who does what and when, for sure.
We're running over time, so quick last comment from Jonas, and then we'll close.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much for the questions also. So I think it's been a slow process. I've worked in UN processes both in New York and in Bonn for the last 15 years. But I do think that there's a shift happening here. And I guess the question is more towards, and that's also to go to the who does what when. I think there is a shift happening in terms of being more open to using the UNFCCC's convening power. Now the question is, then how do we affect real change? And we've gone through a lot of early attempts. The Thames have also been one example. And so I think that there is some learning. There's some learning in how we involve political level. And there is also some learning on how we involve not only just the sectors, but also the actors within those sectors. And so I think we have some processes now, like the high-level champions also, but other processes as well, not only international processes, but also some of the coalitions and presidency initiatives. So I really like the word that Tom also used, kind of a docking station also for these processes. And so can we use that to create a feedback loop also between decision makers within different sectors, then perhaps we will be able to get some more action on the ground.
Thank you very much, and please join me in giving this panel a round of applause. And with that, there's another event coming in, so stick around for that if you want. Thank you very much, all. Thanks a lot. It's good. Good discussion. Not done yet. No. Thanks, Alden. Some more work to do.